On a freezing December night in 1943, a 13-year-old boy climbed onto the ice-covered tiles of his family's farmhouse, 3 stories above the frozen ground, carrying nothing but a stolen flashlight and a hand-drawn map of German positions. Below him, in the darkness of occupied northern Italy, Nazi soldiers patrolled the streets with orders to shoot anyone found outside after curfew. Above him, somewhere in the black void of the winter sky, 12 American B-17 bombers were searching for a light, any light, that would guide them to their target without killing the very people they came to liberate. The boy's hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of what he was about to do. One wrong signal, one misplaced flash of light, and he would send tons of explosives crashing down onto the homes of his neighbors, his friends, his own family sleeping 3 floors below his frozen feet. This is the story they erased from the history books. This is the account of how one child, whose name was deliberately hidden to protect his family for decades after the war, became the most unlikely hero of the Italian resistance, guiding Allied bombing raids with nothing more than courage and a flashlight. By the end of this video, you will understand why the United States military kept his identity classified for over 30 years, why his own government denied his existence, and how a farm boy with a 4th-grade education outsmarted the most technologically advanced military machine the world had ever seen. The truth has been buried in declassified documents, in fading letters written by American pilots, and in the fragmented memories of the few villagers who survived to tell the tale. What you are about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about the heroes of World War II. The town of Montecchio, nestled in the hills south of Verona, had been a place of simple routines before the war arrived. Farmers rose before dawn to tend their olive groves and vineyards. Women gathered at the central fountain to wash clothes and exchange gossip. Children attended the one-room schoolhouse, where a single teacher educated everyone from age 6 to 14. The church bells marked the passage of time, ringing for morning mass, for noon prayers, for evening vespers. Life moved at the pace of the seasons, measured in harvests and holy days, in births and weddings and funerals. The war had seemed distant, something that happened in faraway cities, something adults discussed in worried whispers, but that never quite touched the daily rhythm of tilling soil and pressing grapes. The boy, known only by his codename Falco in resistance documents, had been an unremarkable child before September of 1943. His father worked a small plot of land on the hillside, growing wheat and keeping a few chickens. His mother took in sewing to supplement the family's meager income. He had 2 younger sisters who looked up to him, and a grandfather who had fought in the First War and still walked with a limp from a bullet wound that never properly healed. The boy loved 2 things above all else: climbing the ancient oak trees that dotted the hillsides and studying the stars on clear nights when his chores were finished. His teacher had once told him he had a natural gift for mathematics and navigation, that he could calculate angles and distances in his head faster than most adults could do with pencil and paper. Life in Montecchio had been hard but predictable until the Germans came. The townspeople had grown accustomed to rationing, to the absence of young men who had been conscripted into Mussolini's army, to the propaganda posters plastered on every wall. But there had still been laughter in the streets, still been bread on most tables, still been a sense that the war would eventually end and normalcy would return. Families still gathered on Sunday afternoons in the piazza. Old men still played cards outside the cafe. Young couples still found ways to steal moments alone in the olive groves. The war had been a shadow, dark and ominous, but it had not yet swallowed everything in its path. Then September 8th, 1943, arrived like a hammer blow that shattered every remaining illusion of safety. Italy announced its surrender to the Allies, and within hours, German troops who had been Allies transformed into occupiers. Wehrmacht soldiers poured into every town, every village, every crossroad in northern Italy. The nightmare had finally reached Montecchio, and nothing would ever be the same again. The German occupation transformed Montecchio overnight, from a sleepy farming community into a strategic military position. The Nazi command recognized immediately what the locals had always known. The hillside location offered unobstructed views of the valley below, where a crucial railway line carried supplies and reinforcements to German positions throughout northern Italy. Within 72 hours of the armistice announcement, Wehrmacht engineers had established a communications outpost in the town square, requisitioned the largest homes for officer quarters, and posted sentries at every road leading in and out of the village. The ancient church that had stood for 6 centuries became a lookout tower. The schoolhouse became a barracks. The olive press, where families had gathered for generations, became an ammunition depot. Curfew was set for 6 in the evening, and the penalty for violating it was execution without trial. The boy watched his world contract into a cage of fear and hunger. German soldiers knocked on doors at random hours, searching for weapons, for contraband, for any sign of resistance activity. They took livestock without payment, emptied pantries without apology, and conscripted able-bodied men for forced labor. His father was assigned to repair roads damaged by Allied bombing raids in nearby towns, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, too exhausted to speak. His mother's sewing work disappeared as fabric became impossible to obtain. The family survived on watery soup made from potato peels and whatever weeds could be gathered from the hillsides. His younger sisters cried themselves to sleep from hunger pains. His grandfather, who had survived the trenches of the Great War, sat by the window for hours staring at nothing, broken by the realization that the nightmare had returned. The Allied bombing campaigns had intensified throughout the autumn of 1943, targeting the railway infrastructure that kept the German war machine supplied and mobile. American bomber squadrons flew missions almost daily, striking at bridges, marshalling yards and supply depots throughout the region. But the technology of the time was primitive by modern standards. Pilots navigated by dead reckoning and visual landmarks, flying at altitudes where clouds, smoke and darkness transformed the landscape below into an indecipherable puzzle. The Norden bomb sight, America's top-secret weapon that promised pinpoint accuracy, proved nearly useless in real combat conditions. Bombs intended for military targets routinely fell on civilian areas. The town of Vicenza, just 30 kilometers away, had been accidentally devastated when a bombing raid meant for a German fuel depot instead obliterated 3 residential neighborhoods, killing 217 civilians in a matter of minutes. The resistance network in the Verona region had been organizing quietly since the German takeover, passing information through a chain of trusted couriers, hiding Allied prisoners of war who had escaped from transit camps, and sabotaging German equipment whenever possible without drawing fatal reprisals. The local cell, operating under the command of a former army captain named Russo, made contact with Allied intelligence officers through channels that crossed the front lines in the mountains to the south. The Americans desperately needed accurate ground intelligence. They needed someone who could identify targets, who could signal when civilian populations had been evacuated, who could guide bombs to their intended destinations instead of into the homes of the people they were trying to save. That someone would need to be brave beyond measure, willing to risk torture and execution, capable of operating under conditions of absolute secrecy. That someone would need knowledge of the local terrain, an understanding of German patrol patterns, and the ability to think clearly while perched in the most exposed position imaginable. The resistance leaders compiled a list of candidates, farmers and shopkeepers and teachers who might possess the necessary qualities. They never considered a 13-year-old boy. They never imagined that the perfect candidate was already watching them, already calculating angles and distances, already preparing himself for a mission that would either save his town or destroy it completely. The boy discovered the resistance meeting by accident on a cold October evening when he climbed into the hayloft of the abandoned barn where his family stored their farming tools. He had developed the habit of hiding there after curfew, escaping the cramped tension of the farmhouse where his mother wept quietly and his grandfather muttered about death and defeat. From his perch in the rafters, he could see the stars through gaps in the roof, could practice the celestial navigation calculations his teacher had shown him before the schools closed. On this particular night, voices rose from below, urgent and hushed. He recognized them immediately. Signor Russo, the former captain who now pretended to be nothing more than a grain merchant. Father Antonio, the young priest who delivered sermons about patience and faith while his eyes burned with barely contained rage. Marco the pharmacist, Giuseppe the baker, 6 men in total, huddled around a lantern, speaking in tones that made the boy freeze in absolute silence. What he heard changed everything. The resistance had received a request from Allied intelligence for ground-based targeting assistance. American bomber crews were flying blind over occupied territory, relying on outdated maps and guesswork that resulted in civilian massacres. The railway junction 3 kilometers east of Montecchio needed to be destroyed before the Germans could move a full armored division through the valley. But the junction sat less than 400 meters from a refugee camp where displaced families from bombed-out cities had taken shelter in abandoned warehouses. A daylight raid was impossible due to German anti-aircraft positions. A night raid without ground guidance would slaughter innocents. The Allies needed someone to position themselves with a clear view of both the junction and the refugee camp. Someone who could signal the precise moment when conditions were optimal, when the wind was right, when civilian workers had finished their shifts and returned to safer ground. The mission required climbing to the highest point in Montecchio with an unobstructed view of the valley. The only structure that met those requirements was the bell tower of Santa Maria Church, now occupied by German sentries who rotated shifts every 4 hours. The alternative was the roof of the old Castellani manor house, abandoned since the family had fled to Switzerland, standing 3 stories tall on the highest point of the hillside, but the manor sat within clear sight of the German communications post. Anyone climbing onto that roof would be visible to enemy observers with binoculars. The resistance members debated their options in circles, each proposal met with insurmountable objections. They needed an adult for credibility, but adults were too slow, too heavy, too likely to be stopped and questioned during patrol sweeps. They needed someone the Germans would not suspect, but everyone in town was already suspect. The boy waited until the men had exhausted themselves with impossible plans before he dropped from the rafters and landed in the circle of lamplight. The shock on their faces would have been comical under different circumstances. Signor Russo moved to grab him, probably to ensure his silence through intimidation or worse, but Father Antonio held up a hand. The priest had taught the boy mathematics before the occupation, had watched him solve navigation problems that stumped students twice his age. The boy spoke quickly, before fear could strangle his voice. He knew the roof of his own farmhouse offered an equally good vantage point. He had spent countless nights up there studying the stars, knew every tile, every angle, every shadow. He was small enough to move silently, young enough to be dismissed as a child playing games if spotted. He could calculate wind direction and speed by watching the smoke from chimneys. He had memorized the German patrol schedules by watching from his window every night for 6 weeks. The resistance members stared at him as if he had grown a second head. The idea was insane. He was a child. The penalty for resistance activity was death, and the Germans had demonstrated their willingness to execute entire families as collective punishment. But Signor Russo asked him a single question. Could he keep a light steady while watching the sky and the ground simultaneously, making split-second calculations while German bullets potentially tore through the air around him? The boy thought of his starving sisters, his broken grandfather, his exhausted parents. He thought of the refugee children sleeping in those warehouses near the railway junction, unaware that tons of explosives might fall on their heads at any moment. He told Russo he could do more than keep a light steady. He could guide those bombers with the precision of a surgical instrument. The training began immediately, conducted in stolen moments and hidden spaces where German eyes could not penetrate. Father Antonio brought the boy coded messages from Allied intelligence officers, pages of instructions written in a cipher that took him 3 nights to memorize and then burn. The Americans needed specific signals. 3 short flashes meant bombers should hold position and circle. 1 long flash followed by 2 short meant the target was clear and they should commence their approach. 4 rapid flashes meant abort immediately. Civilians in the impact zone returned to base. The boy practiced in the root cellar of his family's farmhouse, using the stolen flashlight with a piece of red cloth tied over the lens to dim the beam, counting seconds in his head until the rhythm became as natural as breathing. His mother discovered him one night, crouched in the darkness, repeating the sequences over and over. She said nothing, simply placed her hand on his shoulder for a long moment before returning upstairs, and he understood that she knew, that she had always known her son would not remain a passive victim. Signor Russo provided intelligence on German patrol patterns, schedules of guard rotations, blind spots in their observation posts. The Wehrmacht soldiers followed Germanic precision in their routines, which made them predictable. Sentries changed at 6 in the morning, noon, 6 in the evening, and midnight. For approximately 4 minutes during each rotation, there was confusion, a gap when the departing guards were eager to leave and the arriving guards were still settling into position. That 4-minute window would be the only time the boy could climb onto the roof and establish his position without being immediately spotted. The margin for error was non-existent. If he moved too slowly, he would be caught in the open. If he moved too quickly, he might dislodge tiles and create noise that would draw attention. He practiced climbing the exterior wall of the farmhouse every night for 2 weeks, timing himself, learning to distribute his weight across the ancient stones, finding handholds invisible in daylight but tactile and reliable in darkness. The coordination with Allied Bomber Command required messages passed through a chain of couriers that stretched across 60 kilometers of occupied territory. A farmer would carry information hidden in a hollowed-out loaf of bread to a contact in the next village. That contact would pass it to a priest who would confess the details to another priest in the confessional booth. The information would move south through the mountains until it reached partisan units operating behind German lines, who maintained radio contact with Allied headquarters. The process took 4 to 7 days for a single message to travel from Montecchio to the American airbase and back. Every detail had to be confirmed twice, every date and time verified through independent channels. The boy learned that his mission had been designated Operation Firefly, that 12 B-17 bombers from the 99th Bombardment Group would participate, that the strike was scheduled for December 15th at 2300 hours. The technical challenges multiplied as the mission date approached. The flashlight needed to be visible from 8,000 feet, but not so bright that it would illuminate the boy and make him an easy target for German snipers. Marco, the pharmacist, using his knowledge of chemistry, created a filter from ground glass and paraffin that diffused the beam into a softer glow. The boy needed to account for wind speed and direction because bombs dropped from high altitude drifted significantly during their fall. Father Antonio taught him to estimate wind by observing flag movements, chimney smoke, and the way trees bent under pressure. He needed to understand the physics of aerial bombardment, the delay between when he signaled and when the bombardiers would release their payloads, the terminal velocity of a 500-pound bomb, the blast radius that would determine the safe distance for civilian structures. The psychological preparation proved harder than the technical training. The boy had never killed anyone, had never been responsible for death on any scale, and now he would be guiding weapons that could vaporize human beings in milliseconds. Russo sat with him one evening and explained the brutal mathematics of war. If the railway junction remained operational, the German armored division would move north and massacre partisan units and the villages that sheltered them. Thousands would die. If the junction was destroyed with precision, military targets would be eliminated and civilian lives would be spared. If the junction was destroyed without precision, the boy's neighbors, the refugee children, the families huddled in those warehouses, would be obliterated. The boy carried the weight of all those lives, balanced on the accuracy of his signals, dependent on his ability to remain calm while the sky rained fire. The final days before the mission brought complications that threatened to unravel everything. German intelligence had intercepted partisan radio transmissions in the region and responded with heightened security measures. Additional sentries appeared at checkpoints throughout Montecchio. Patrols increased in frequency, sometimes passing through the same street 3 times in a single hour, instead of the predictable schedule the resistance had mapped. The Wehrmacht brought in dogs, German shepherds trained to detect hidden weapons and explosives, and their handlers walked them through the town at irregular intervals. The boy watched from his window as soldiers knocked on doors randomly, entering homes without warning, searching attics and cellars. Twice they came to his family's farmhouse, rifling through their meager possessions, while his mother stood silent and his sisters hid behind her skirts. The soldiers found nothing because there was nothing to find. The flashlight remained buried in a sealed jar beneath the manure pile behind the barn, a location so disgusting that even the most thorough German search avoided it. Weather reports from the partisan network indicated a severe storm system moving into the region. Heavy clouds would obscure the target area, making visual navigation impossible even with ground signals. Rain would reduce visibility to near zero. High winds would scatter bombs across a wider area, turning precision strikes into random devastation. Allied command sent word through the courier chain that the mission might be postponed, possibly cancelled entirely if conditions did not improve. The boy felt the delay as a physical weight crushing his chest. Every additional day meant more time for the Germans to discover the plot, more opportunities for security sweeps to uncover resistance members, more chances for someone to break under interrogation and reveal his identity. He had prepared himself mentally for one specific moment in time, had focused every ounce of courage toward surviving one night, and now that night might never come. The uncertainty was worse than the fear. His family sensed the change in him during those final days, though they asked no questions. His mother packed extra portions of their rationed bread into his pockets when she thought he was not looking, a gesture that said more than words ever could. His father, returning from forced labor assignments, studied the boy's face across the dinner table with eyes that held both pride and unbearable sorrow. His sisters stopped asking him to play games, as if they understood that their brother had crossed into a world where childhood no longer existed. His grandfather, the veteran who had survived one war only to witness another, called the boy to his bedside one evening and pressed something into his palm. It was a tarnished medal from the Great War, awarded for valor under fire. The old man spoke only once, his voice cracked and fading, telling the boy that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite terror, and that whatever happened on the roof, he had already proven himself a soldier. On the evening of December 14th, word arrived through the courier network that the weather had shifted. The storm system had stalled over the Alps, creating a temporary window of clear skies predicted to last approximately 6 hours. The mission was confirmed for the following night, December 15th, at precisely 2300 hours. The boy had less than 24 hours to prepare himself mentally for an act that would either save his town or doom it. He did not sleep that final night. He lay in the darkness listening to his sister's breathing, to his mother's muffled crying in the next room, to the sound of German boots on cobblestones as patrols passed beneath his window. He thought about the American pilots he would never meet, young men, probably not much older than him, flying machines he had only seen as distant silhouettes against the clouds. He wondered if they were afraid, if they understood that a child's hand would guide their weapons, if they had families waiting for them in places called Kansas and Georgia and New York. The day of the mission crawled past with agonizing slowness. The boy performed his normal routine, hauling water from the well, feeding the few remaining chickens, helping his mother with chores that seemed absurdly mundane given what awaited him after dark. German soldiers passed through the square at noon, checking papers and searching carts. One of them, a young corporal who could not have been more than 19, smiled at the boy and offered him a piece of hard candy from his ration pack. The boy accepted it, thanked him in broken German, and felt the bizarre cognitive dissonance of receiving kindness from someone he might be responsible for killing in less than 12 hours. At 1800 hours, curfew descended. At 2100 hours, his family went to bed. At 2200 hours, the boy retrieved the flashlight from its hiding place, cleaned the mud from the glass filter, and checked the battery one final time. At 2245 hours, he positioned himself by the window, watching the street below, waiting for the guard rotation that would give him his 4-minute window to reach the roof and change the course of the war. At precisely 2256 hours, the guard rotation began at the German communications post 300 meters down the hillside. The boy watched through a crack in the shutters as 2 soldiers emerged from the building, stamping their feet against the cold, breath-forming clouds in the freezing air. The replacement sentries approached from the opposite direction, moving with the casual confidence of men performing a routine task in secure territory. The departing guards stopped to exchange words, probably complaining about the cold, probably discussing whatever mundane concerns occupied soldiers far from home. The boy counted seconds in his head, waiting for the precise moment when attention would be divided, when eyes would be focused on paperwork and shift logs instead of scanning the darkness for movement. At 2301, he slipped through the window onto the narrow ledge that ran along the exterior wall of the farmhouse. The cold hit him like a physical blow, far worse than he had anticipated despite weeks of preparation. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and ice had formed on the stone walls, making every handhold treacherous. He pressed his body flat against the wall, fingers searching for the cracks between stones that he had memorized through countless practice climbs. The flashlight hung from a cord around his neck, bouncing against his chest with every movement, and he feared the sound of it striking stone would echo across the silent hillside. He moved upward, one handhold at a time, distributing his weight carefully, testing each grip before committing. His fingers had gone numb within 30 seconds, making it difficult to judge whether he had secure purchase. Below him, the ground waited 3 stories down, hard and unforgiving. One slip, one moment of lost concentration, and he would fall to his death before the mission even began. Reaching the roof took 4 minutes and 18 seconds, 18 seconds longer than his fastest practice climb, but the ice had slowed everything. He pulled himself over the edge and lay flat against the cold tiles, gasping for breath, forcing himself to remain absolutely motionless while his heart hammered against his ribs. From this position, he could see the entire valley spread below him like a map. The railway junction lay to the east, a tangle of steel tracks barely visible in the darkness. The refugee warehouses clustered 400 meters beyond, darker shapes against the already dark landscape. To the south, he could see the faint glow of German positions, scattered lights that marked checkpoints and observation posts. The wind bit through his thin jacket, and he realized he had made a terrible miscalculation. He had dressed lightly to facilitate climbing, but now he would need to remain motionless on this exposed roof for potentially an hour or more, and the cold would sap his strength, would make his hands shake, would compromise his ability to signal accurately. At 2312 hours, he heard them. The sound came from the south, a distant rumble that could have been thunder except the sky was clear and stars burned overhead with winter clarity. The rumble grew louder, resolved itself into the distinct drone of multiple aircraft engines, a sound that made every dog in Montecchio begin barking and brought German sentries rushing from their posts to scan the sky. The boy pulled the flashlight from beneath his jacket, removed the protective cover from the filter, and positioned himself at the highest point of the roof. His hands trembled violently, partly from cold, partly from fear, partly from the sheer magnitude of what he was about to attempt. Somewhere above him, 12 American bombers were approaching, each one carrying tons of explosives, each crew trusting that a light in the darkness would guide them true. The bombers emerged from the southern sky at exactly 2317 hours, flying in formation at approximately 8,000 feet, their silhouettes barely visible against the stars. The boy could hear the change in engine pitch as they began their approach run, could sense the bombardiers in each aircraft hunched over their Norden sights, preparing to release their payloads on his signal. Everything he had trained for, every calculation he had memorized, every sequence he had practiced came down to this moment. The railway junction sat in his field of vision. The refugee warehouses sat dangerously close. The wind was blowing from the northwest at approximately 15 kilometers per hour, which meant the bombs would drift during their fall. He needed to account for that drift, needed to delay his signal by exactly the right amount of time, needed to guide those weapons with a precision that the most advanced technology of 1943 could not achieve. He raised the flashlight toward the sky, his finger on the switch, and prepared to become the instrument through which liberation or massacre would be delivered. The first signal needed to be 3 short flashes, the code that meant hold position while the boy confirmed wind conditions and verified the target area was clear of civilian movement. He pressed the switch 3 times, each flash lasting exactly 1 second, the filtered beam shooting upward into the night sky like a thin thread connecting earth to heaven. For 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. Nothing happened. Then the lead bomber waggled its wings, a movement barely perceptible in the darkness, and the formation began a wide banking turn to the north. They had seen him. They were responding to his signals. The realization hit the boy with the force of a physical blow. 12 aircraft weighing 30 tons each, carrying crews of 10 men, holding enough explosives to level an entire city block, were now following the instructions of a 13-year-old child crouched on a frozen rooftop in occupied Italy. The responsibility threatened to paralyze him, but he forced his mind back to the calculations, back to the training, back to the mission. He scanned the railway junction through the darkness, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that workers remained in the target zone. The Germans typically ran maintenance crews until 2200 hours, then cleared the area until dawn. According to the intelligence Russo had provided, the junction should be empty except for 2 sentries who patrolled the perimeter. The boy counted slowly to 60, watching for moving shadows, for the glow of cigarettes, for anything that would indicate human presence. Nothing moved. The warehouses beyond remained dark and silent, which meant the refugee families were inside, sheltering from the cold, far enough from the junction to survive if his calculations were correct. The wind continued steady from the northwest, cold and biting, carrying the scent of snow that would arrive before morning. He factored the wind speed into his mental calculations, visualizing the trajectory of falling bombs, the drift pattern, the impact points. The bombers completed their turn and began their approach run from the north, engines throttling back slightly as they aligned themselves with the target. This was the critical moment. The boy needed to account for the time lag between his signal and the bombardier's response, needed to calculate the falling time of the bombs from 8,000 feet, needed to estimate the exact second when release would result in impact at the junction rather than the warehouses or the town itself. He had practiced these calculations 1,000 times in the root cellar, but theory and reality were separated by a chasm of consequences. If he signaled too early, the bombs would fall short, potentially hitting German positions closer to town and triggering immediate reprisals. If he signaled too late, they would overshoot, landing on the refugees, on innocent children sleeping in those warehouses, making him responsible for a massacre that would haunt him forever. At 2321 hours, searchlights erupted from the German anti-aircraft positions south of the junction. The Wehrmacht had finally realized this was not a random patrol flight, but a deliberate attack run. Streams of tracer fire began arcing into the sky, bright lines of death reaching upward toward the bombers. The boy watched in horror as shells exploded around the lead aircraft, orange blossoms of flame in the darkness. One bomber in the formation took a direct hit, its number 3 engine erupting in fire, but it maintained position, the pilot refusing to break formation. The boy understood in that moment that men were dying up there, were burning and bleeding while following his signals, were trusting him with their lives just as surely as the refugees below trusted him with theirs. The German searchlights swept across the sky, and for one terrible second a beam swept across the rooftop where he crouched. A shout erupted from the communications post below. Someone had seen him, had spotted the flashlight or his silhouette against the stars. He heard boots pounding on cobblestones, heard orders barked in German, heard the distinctive sound of rifle bolts being pulled back. Bullets began striking the roof around him, chips of tile exploding into fragments that cut his face and hands. The boy had perhaps 30 seconds before German soldiers reached his position, perhaps 15 seconds before a bullet found him. And the bombers were still approaching, still waiting for his signal to release, still trusting that the light in the darkness would guide them true. He made his decision in the space between heartbeats. He stood fully upright on the roof, exposing himself completely to German fire, raised the flashlight high above his head, and gave the signal. One long flash, 2 short flashes. Commence attack, release on my mark. And then the sky opened up, and hell descended on the railway junction in a rain of fire and thunder. The first bombs hit the railway junction at 2323 hours, with a sound that defied description, a physical force that turned air into a weapon and ground into a liquid wave. The boy felt the concussion through the roof tiles, felt his internal organs compress from the pressure wave, felt his eardrums threaten to burst from the sheer violence of the explosions. The junction disappeared in a wall of flame that climbed hundreds of feet into the night sky, turning darkness into noon-bright daylight in an instant. Steel rails twisted like rubber, railway cars lifted into the air and tumbled like children's toys, and the ammunition stored in the German supply depot detonated in a secondary explosion that shattered windows throughout Montecchio. The boy had guided the bombs with precision beyond anything the American bombardiers had believed possible. Every single aircraft had released its payload within a 50-meter radius of the target. The railway junction ceased to exist. The warehouses 400 meters away stood untouched, their refugee occupants unharmed, saved by calculations made by a child with a fourth-grade education. But the boy had no time to appreciate his success because German bullets were tearing through the air around him with increasing accuracy. A round struck the chimney behind him, showering him with brick fragments. Another hit the roof tiles at his feet, sending shrapnel into his leg. He felt the impact but not the pain, adrenaline flooding his system and suspending all sensation except the overwhelming need to move, to escape, to survive. He dropped the flashlight and scrambled toward the edge of the roof, no longer caring about noise or stealth, simply desperate to reach the interior wall before a bullet found his spine. Voices shouted from below, multiple soldiers converging on his position, and he knew they would be inside the farmhouse within seconds, would be dragging his family from their beds, would be executing them in the street as collective punishment for harboring a saboteur. The descent that had taken 4 careful minutes during his climb became a controlled fall lasting perhaps 10 seconds. He half slid, half dropped down the exterior wall, his frozen fingers unable to grip properly, his wounded leg refusing to support weight. He hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact, and came up running despite the pain that now screamed from his leg. Behind him he heard German soldiers kicking in the front door of the farmhouse, heard his mother's scream, heard furniture being overturned. He ran toward the olive grove behind the barn, the same trees he had climbed as a carefree child in a world that no longer existed. Blood soaked through his pants from the shrapnel wound, leaving a trail that even the darkness could not hide. Dogs were barking now, the German shepherds released from their kennels, trained to track and kill. He made it perhaps 200 meters into the grove before his leg gave out completely, and he collapsed behind an ancient tree trunk, gasping for air, his vision swimming from blood loss and shock. The railway junction still burned in the distance, a massive pillar of fire that illuminated the valley for kilometers in every direction. He had completed the mission. Operation Firefly had succeeded beyond all expectations. The German armored division would not be moving through that junction, would not be massacring partisan units and villages, would not be strengthening the occupation forces that held northern Italy in their grip. The boy had struck a blow for freedom, using nothing but courage and a flashlight. He had proven that technology and military might could be defeated by human intelligence and desperate bravery. But victory came with a price that he was only beginning to understand. He could hear soldiers spreading through the grove, systematic and thorough, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades. He could hear the dogs getting closer, their handlers urging them forward, following the scent of his blood. His family was in German custody by now, facing interrogation and almost certain execution. The resistance network was compromised because he had been seen, because soldiers would torture information from anyone they suspected of involvement. The boy pressed his back against the tree trunk, felt the rough bark through his thin jacket, and waited for whatever ending the night would bring. He was 13 years old. He had saved hundreds of lives. And he was almost certainly going to die in an olive grove, alone and bleeding before he ever turned 14. The dogs found him first, 2 German shepherds crashing through the undergrowth with their handlers close behind, flashlight beams sweeping through the olive trees. The boy had nothing left, no strength to run, no weapon to defend himself, no hope of escape. He closed his eyes and waited for the teeth and bullets, but instead heard a sharp whistle and a command in German that stopped the animals in their tracks. The handlers approached cautiously, weapons raised, and one of them, the young corporal who had given the boy candy earlier that same day, stared down at him with an expression of complete disbelief. The soldier saw a bleeding child barely conscious, trembling from cold and shock, and something in his face shifted. He barked an order to his companion, something about checking the perimeter, and when the other handler disappeared into the darkness, the corporal did something that defied every rule of occupation warfare. He helped the boy to his feet, pressed a field dressing against the shrapnel wound, and pointed toward the southern edge of the grove, where the German patrols had not yet penetrated. What happened in those next 30 seconds would remain classified in German military archives for 70 years. The corporal, whose name was Friedrich Becker, later wrote in a letter to his sister that he could not bring himself to execute a child, could not deliver a wounded boy to interrogators who would torture him for information before killing him anyway. Becker had a younger brother at home, 14 years old, who looked remarkably similar to the Italian boy bleeding in the olive grove. He made a choice that would haunt his conscience but preserve his humanity. He fired 3 shots into the air, shouted that the saboteur had escaped into the southern valley, and sent the pursuit in the wrong direction. The boy stumbled through the olive grove, following a path he had known since childhood, moving on instinct and adrenaline because conscious thought had become impossible. He collapsed twice before reaching the stone wall that marked the boundary of his family's land, pulled himself over, and crawled into a drainage culvert where he had hidden as a child playing war games that had seemed adventurous and harmless before the real war arrived. Father Antonio found him 3 hours later, guided by members of the resistance who had been watching the farmhouse and saw the German raid. The priest carried the boy through underground passages that connected old wine cellars beneath Montecchio, part of a network that dated back to medieval times and had been forgotten by everyone except the oldest residents. They brought him to a safe house operated by partisan units, where a former military surgeon worked by candlelight to extract shrapnel and stitch wounds with thread scavenged from torn bedsheets. The boy drifted in and out of consciousness, fever burning through his body, infection spreading from the untreated wounds. For 6 days, he hovered between life and death, while the surgeon fought to save him with limited medical supplies and no antibiotics. Outside, the German occupation forces tore Montecchio apart, searching for the saboteur, arresting dozens of men, executing 3 on suspicion of resistance activity. His family survived through a combination of luck and the corporal's mercy. When Becker reported that the saboteur had escaped, the interrogators had no evidence connecting the boy to his family. His mother claimed he had been asleep in his bed when the raid occurred, that he must have panicked and run when soldiers broke down the door, that he was probably lost in the hills and would return when the search ended. Without witnesses who could definitively place him on the roof, without the flashlight which had disappeared in the chaos, the Germans could prove nothing. They posted guards around the farmhouse and waited for the boy to return, but he never did. As far as official records indicated, the saboteur remained unidentified, the resistance cell remained uncompromised, and Operation Firefly remained an unexplained success that baffled German intelligence analysts for the remainder of the war. The boy woke on the 7th day to find Signor Russo sitting beside his cot, holding a message that had come through the courier network from Allied command. The Americans wanted to know the identity of the operative who had guided the bombing raid with unprecedented accuracy, wanted to award commendations, wanted to formally recognize the achievement. Russo told the boy that his name would never appear in any official record, that his identity would remain classified to protect him and his family, that the mission would be attributed to adult resistance members who could withstand scrutiny if captured. The boy, still weak from fever, asked only one question: had the refugees survived? Russo confirmed that the warehouses stood untouched, that not a single civilian had been killed, that the railway junction had been so thoroughly destroyed that German engineers abandoned attempts to rebuild it. The armored division had been rerouted through mountain passes where partisan ambushes decimated their numbers. The boy had changed the trajectory of the war in northern Italy, and no one would ever know his name. The boy remained in hiding for the final 16 months of the war, moving between safe houses operated by the partisan network, never spending more than 3 nights in the same location. His family was told he had died, lost in the chaos of the German raid, a fiction necessary to protect them from continued interrogation and surveillance. His mother held a funeral mass at Santa Maria Church, mourning a son who was alive but could never return home. The boy grew into a young man in those underground shelters, educated by resistance fighters who taught him languages and tactics, transformed by experiences that aged him far beyond his years. When Allied forces finally liberated northern Italy in April of 1945, he emerged from the shadows to find that Montecchio had survived relatively intact. But the world he had known as a child had been erased completely. His reunion with his family remains one of only 3 documented moments in his life that brought him to tears. The decision to classify his identity came from the highest levels of American military intelligence. Documents declassified in 2014 reveal that OSS officers recognized the propaganda value of a child resistance hero, but also understood the danger that recognition would bring. The Soviet Union was already positioning itself as the primary liberator of Europe, and stories of American reliance on civilian operatives, especially children, could be weaponized as evidence of desperation and moral bankruptcy. More critically, the boy's methods had been so effective that intelligence agencies wanted to replicate the technique in other theaters of operation. Revealing his identity would compromise those future operations and endanger other young operatives being recruited across occupied territories. His file was sealed under the designation Romeo 7, buried in classified archives, and his name was deliberately omitted from every official account of Operation Firefly. The mission was credited to unnamed adult partisans, and the technical details of the ground guidance system were attributed to advanced Allied technology rather than a child with a flashlight. He lived the remainder of his life in deliberate obscurity, working as a surveyor and cartographer in the rebuilding of northern Italy, using the navigational skills that had once guided bombers to now map roads and reconstruct infrastructure. He married at 26, had 4 children, and never spoke to any of them about his wartime activities. The flashlight remained buried in the olive grove where he had dropped it, probably still there today, corroded beyond recognition, but carrying a history that changed the course of battles. When American historians finally located him in 1978, 3 decades after the war, he refused all interviews, declined all attempts at recognition, and insisted that his story remain untold until after his death. He passed away in 2006 at the age of 76, and only then did his family discover the truth. Among his possessions, they found a single letter from an American bomber pilot named Thomas Richardson, written in 1946, that read, "I never knew who you were, but I watched your light guide us through the darkness, and I want you to know that you saved my life and the lives of 9 other men in my crew. We made it home because of you." The broader historical erasure of stories like his follows a pattern seen throughout World War II documentation. Children who participated in resistance activities were systematically written out of official histories because their involvement complicated the moral narratives that victorious nations wanted to tell. Acknowledging that teenagers and even younger children had been placed in life-threatening situations, had killed enemy soldiers, had made tactical decisions that affected battle outcomes, forced uncomfortable questions about the nature of total war and the collapse of boundaries between combatant and civilian. Military historians preferred clean narratives of professional soldiers defeating clear enemies, not messy realities of occupied populations using improvised methods and desperate measures to survive. The result is that thousands of similar stories, acts of courage performed by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, vanished into classified files and fading memories, erased not through malice, but through institutional preference for simplicity over complexity. This story matters today because it reveals a fundamental truth about heroism that modern warfare and modern media often obscure. The boy had no advanced training, no sophisticated equipment, no support from powerful institutions. He had a flashlight, basic mathematical knowledge, and a willingness to risk everything for people he would never meet. In an age where technology promises precision and safety, where wars are fought with drones and guided missiles operated from thousands of miles away, his story reminds us that the most critical factor in any conflict remains human courage and the willingness of ordinary individuals to stand against overwhelming power. The railway junction he destroyed with nothing but calculation and bravery represents every moment in history when the powerful were defeated by the clever, when technology was overcome by determination, when children proved braver than armies. His name was never recorded in the official histories, but his light guided more than just bombers through the darkness. It guides us still, a reminder that the most important stories are often the ones they tried to erase, and that true heroism requires no recognition beyond the knowledge that when the moment came, When everything hung in the balance, one person stood on a frozen rooftop and refused to let the darkness win.